Hi everyone, my name is Professor Warren, and today we're going to be talking about how to find good sources for your paper and how to then evaluate the credibility of those sources to make sure that they're good for whatever type of paper you're writing for college. So let's get started. Skip the free writing, you guys will do that. So let's first start off with this question, which is what is research? Because when I ask this question, I have students come up with a variety of different answers, whether it's just, I looked it up, or, oh, well, I did extensive, digging through the internet, or I looked on Reddit, right? So according to, what your book says, research can be easily understood as the creation of new knowledge and or the use of existing knowledge in a new and creative way. So that means that you shouldn't be just regurgitating what somebody else said and, that's it. What you should be doing with whatever it is that you find is either you create something new with that, or you take what somebody else found and you either add something or do something new with it in a creative way. And the reason why this definition exists is because that's what actual researchers and scholars do. If researchers and scholars, if the only thing that they did was they kept publishing the exact same studies, every few months, then we as a human race would not know anything. We wouldn't be where we are technologically. And so that's what research is. It's you find something, right, credible sources that somebody else has, constructed, whether they did a survey, some sort of other research project, and then you utilize what they have used, giving them credit, of course, but then you add something new to that conversation. And as we've been saying this entire semester, that's academic discourse, right? You're building on a particular conversation, adding to what's already been there. So, now that we have that out of the way, right? Research isn't just finding something and yoinking it, right? You're finding things, but you're then adding something new to those things. Now you have to kind of find and evaluate those sources. So let's talk first about evaluating sources, because it's not going to take us that long to actually find sources, but let's start with how to make sure that these are good sources to begin with. So, researchers in particular utilize a wide variety of sources. They use scholarly articles, they use various journal articles, they use news articles, statistics, things like that. But even though they're utilizing these sources, they still have to evaluate the quality of those sources. Just because something is an academic article or just because it's published by, WebMD, right, doesn't mean that it may be accurate or that there aren't any faults within that research. So, just because something looks credible, shouldn't take it at face value. So here are some of the questions you should ask whenever you're looking at a source and evaluating whether you want to use it. The first one is relevance. Is it relevant to whatever it is that you're arguing or whatever it is that you're studying? That may seem pretty, duh, right? But a lot of students will just grab things because they're told they have to have sources, and they use things that just are not related to their argument. So first off, make sure it's going to fit in with your argument. The second thing is you should check the credentials of the author. So what do I mean by credentials? Credentials are the things that somebody has that makes them a voice for whatever it is they're speaking about. So for instance, if you are a pediatrician, right, a child doctor, and you are talking about, things related to children's health, you would have good credentials, right? Now, if you are a doctor with a PhD in philosophy, just because you're a doctor doesn't mean that you're qualified to be speaking about health, right? Especially if you have a doctorate in philosophy. So check the credentials of the author. There are some scrupulous people out there that they'll have a PhD, right? Maybe they bought one from a very scammy website, didn't actually earn it, or they do have a doctor, but it's not in a thing they're either talking about or what they're writing about. So always check the credentials of the author. And that goes into the next one. Try to understand the stance of the author, because even though if they have good credentials, doesn't mean that they may not be unbiased. So when you're reading through their work, ask yourself, what position are they taking? Do they seem biased? Are they presenting their opposition in a fair way? Do they make their points clear, or do they misrepresent their opponents? This way they can quote unquote win their argument. So always look at their credentials, look at their stance, right? Are they biased? Are they providing equal evidence for their opposition? Consider those things. Next is consider the credentials of the publisher or sponsor. So once you move past the author, maybe they're trustworthy, maybe they try to be unbiased. Now you need to take into consideration the credentials of the publisher, because whatever medium they're using to publish their work, you have to realize that that source likely, may be untrustworthy. Just because maybe someone who is trustworthy posts for maybe a fake news website or something like that, you then have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Why, maybe that publisher is using that credible person in a way to try to manipulate people. And that kind of goes into the stance of the publisher, right? Are they an unbiased source, or do they tend to take positions, maybe left wing, right wing, what have you? Currency. So again, one of the other things you should consider is currency. Is it current? Students will always ask me, what do I consider to be current? And I always say, hey, try to get research within the last 10 years, but there are times when you will have to reference sources that may be older. However, when you reference things that are older than 10 years, be aware that because academic discourse, right, it's building on new knowledge, that if you're taking something older, that might be an outdated view of whatever discourse you're talking about, or it just may not be very relevant anymore, or maybe is something that everybody knows at this point, right? It's been out for a couple of years. So try to get things within the last 10 years. Don't try to just pull from something too old, because either, people have already read it and they already know it, so it's not even mentioned really bringing it up, or maybe it was a position that was held about that discourse in the past, and then people realize, oh, that's not accurate, so we don't reference that anymore. So always consider the currency. Accuracy. So does the author cite their sources? And if they are their sources quality? So again, particularly if you're using a website, right? If you're reading a website article and they aren't citing their sources, that should be a red flag. And if they are, right, if they are citing their sources, double check them. Do they have a hyperlink? If you click on the hyperlink, is it broken, right? That could be a very red flag, because good research just doesn't disappear, right? So you want to make sure that whatever it is that you're using is accurate, and that the person you're listening to is accurate. And then level of specialization. This kind of touches what I just said earlier, where, again, does that person have the credentials in their field? What is their level of specialization? So this sort of maybe fits more with people who maybe don't have a degree, but maybe they've been in a particular field for 15, 20 years, right? And they may, have that level of specialization where they don't have a, shiny degree, but they have that experience. So always consider their level of specialization, right? How long have they been doing this? Do they have enough research in this field? If so, how long have they been doing it? Things like that. One other thing that we have to cover before we really get into how to find these sources is the difference between primary and secondary sources. So I'm going to leave this for a few seconds, just kind of look through them really quickly, and I want you to see if you can figure out what's the difference between a primary and a secondary source. So let's just take a few minutes for that. So some of the things you may be seeing are, on the primary sources, we got diaries, autobiographies, interviews, and in secondary sources, we get like textbooks, political commentary, criticism, right? Kind of looked at it? Okay. So the difference between primary and secondary sources is that primary sources are firsthand accounts, right? They are taken from either the word of the author, right? It's their own word about their life or what have you. Or it's, firsthand accounts of events, time periods, things like that. These people are authoritative because they've experienced it, they've witnessed it, right? They've been part of it. Again, just because something is a primary source doesn't mean that it's always credible, right? We can think of things like Christopher Columbus, right, who in his diaries, right, said things that we know weren't accurate, right? His treatment of, indigenous people. So, but it is important to note, right, because primary sources, those first-hand accounts, and if you've already, checked the credibility of the author or the publisher's stance, a good primary source may be a very strong piece of evidence to use in your paper. Secondary sources can also be credible. A lot of students will think, oh, it's a secondary source is not credible, but a secondary source is just somebody has analyzed or interpreted data and they've restated that data. I do this quite a bit because I read a bunch of old and obscure books, right? And so I reinterpret that. And the reason why you have to have people that do that is because there's, like, for instance, in my field, there are so many books that have been written, and some of them, there may only be 1 to 2 copies, some of them have been lost to time. And because they're so rare, nobody has really any access to them unless you either drive to a library, hundreds of miles away and hopefully be able to get in there and look at those books, right? So secondary sources are really good because it allows people to still understand what those things were, even if that person wasn't the primary author, right? Academic articles are secondary sources. They analyze and interpret data, though sometimes they can be primary sources if they're doing this entirely creatively. So just keep that in mind. But just be aware, primary sources, firsthand accounts, they're authoritative. Secondary sources, they're analysis or interpretations. And it's good to know that, again, because if you are quoting, say, oh, Malcolm X said blah, 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 but you were using a secondary source, you weren't using a primary source from him, that might harm your credibility in your paper. So just be aware, right? Primary sources versus secondary sources when you're trying to figure out what type of evidence I need for my research. So starting off, so now you're trying to find some resources. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're probably going to use the internet, as many of us do. So let's start off with looking at URLs, because URLs are a great way to indicate the credibility of a website right off the bat. And again, URLs, the things you search up at the top, hopefully I don't need to explain that. But at the end of URLs, you have things like .edu, .gov, .org, .com. And let's go through a few of these. So .edus or .govs, again, these are from either educational institutions or government agencies. And they often present very factual information. So they are often very good sources of information. However, always be critical of them. Make sure you're on an actual .edu, .gov site, as well as, it might be good to look up the credibility of that university, because there are universities that are scams, right? They're not accredited universities, as well as government institutions. Just because it's a government institution, you always have to consider, depending on the topic, is that government institution going to be a bit biased on the information they're releasing? Usually not, but always consider that. Advocacy websites. So these are .orgs. I have a lot of students that think just because it's a .org, that means that, oh, it must be credible. And there's a few reasons why. I'll go over them in a second, but .orgs are usually not credible, or at least oftentimes misleading. And then we have .urls, which those ones, .coms, not .urls, .coms. And those ones are for your business marketing, right? You see them on, www.facebook.com, stuff like that. They're for businesses, marketing, stuff like that. So this is why I said .org sites are often not credible. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and again, if you have the PowerPoint, I've got a link here if you would like to read more, if this is something that interests you. But what they found out is that they did a random sample of 100 different .org sites, and 49% of them that were .orgs were hate groups. So anytime you click on a .org, you have a 50-50 chance of being on a hate site, so keep that in mind. But even if it's not a hate site, right, say it's a .org for breast cancer awareness, just remember, right, at the end of the day, that .org wants you to donate. It wants your money. So consider that, right? Just because it may not be a hategroup.org doesn't mean that it's not trying to manipulate you in some way, shape, or form, because at the end of the day, they want your donation money. So keep that in mind before you use that source. Other than .org, some other ones that you should consider are, again, credible news sources will use .com. You should also be aware of people's personal web pages, right? A lot of students will pick blogs or .weebly sites. Those ones are blogs that anybody can make. So again, probably not the best sources to use for a research paper. And also be aware of these ones at the bottom that end in .com, .co. These ones are often used by websites like Newslo, and you may see Newslo and not look at the rest of the URL and think, oh, that's a news site, so it must be credible. Newslo is a fake news website, and the .com, .co tells us that that's a satire site, right? A sort of, kind of like The Onion, a funny piece, right? But they hide behind that fact and say, oh, we're a satire site and people should know that everything that we post, even though it looks like real news, is actually satire. And they do that to trick people. This way, when people, fall for it and people point them out, they say, well, right, our URL ended in .com, .co, so you should have known. So again, just because it has the word news in its name or it looks like a news article, check the URL, right? A good news source, will have a .com. Again, there are some bad ones that will have .com, but looking at that .com, .co can help to instantly clear up any confusion. So let's talk a little bit more about websites. So another way to check the validity of a website is the first thing, look at the advertisements, right? Or is the sides littered with advertisements? Are there a lot of pop-ups, right? Now, just because there are a lot of advertisements doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? There are credible news sources that have advertisements on their website, and that's just the state of journalism. But a source that's not a news site and it's just a website, if you see a lot of advertisements, it should clue you in that, hey, this website wanted me to click on this, right? And this website could be clickbait because everyone who comes to the site is making ad revenue off the clicks. So first off, if you're seeing advertisements, that should be maybe red flag number one. The next one, if you're on a website and it says, hey, ice cream gives you brain cancer, right? And they're like, this link proves it. And you click the link and it's either out of date or it's broken, right? It can't take you to the web page. That should be another red flag because good research doesn't disappear. So if the link is broken, that should be another red flag. Also, when you're on a website, some of them will have the date that they were last updated. It's usually at the bottom. Check that. Has the website been updated, right? Is it 10 years, 15 years? You need to make sure that the research that they're presenting is current. Grammatical errors. Again, I had a student that kept using the same source because it looked like a college website, like that you would go for like at Fayetteville State, NC State, right? You type those in, you go on their, web pages. But there were so many grammatical errors and lo and behold, it was a scam university, right? They want you to send their money and they're going to scam you, right? So look at the site. Is there misspellings? Is there things that aren't grammatically correct? That should be another red flag. And then again, Wikipedia. I'm not adamantly opposed to Wikipedia. I'll show you here in a little bit on how to use Wikipedia in a smart way. But again, if you're on Wikipedia, don't just take what it says at face value. See if they've linked a source to whatever it is they're saying, and then double check that source. Wikipedia can be a good way to kind of start research, but it shouldn't be the end-all be-all. So you should always follow this method. It's called the TARP method. Again, when you're looking at websites, check the timeliness. Is it current? Check the authority. Who's saying it and why should we care? What is their ethos, their credibility? Audience. Who are they trying to target? Are they trying to target particular demographics of people? And if so, why? Spoiler alert, probably money, right? But try to think about who they're trying to target with these ads, right? Or with their website. Relevance. Again, is what the website's saying matching what that website is about? So for instance, if you are looking at an article about nuclear armaments, but you're on a Tractor Supply website, that should be a red flag. So is what they're saying matching the credibility or the mission statement of whatever publisher is posting this? And then perspective. Is it biased? Is it unbiased? And if so, right, is it then reputable? One of the other things that you should do right after you know what to look for when you're trying to find websites, now you're trying to find different types of sources in your search bar. And here, students get stuck. And one of the easiest ways you can sort of bypass that is varying your key terms. Again, research isn't straightforward. You're going to have to plug in different words, different phrases to get different results, right? So I had one student that was doing a paper about sexism in the US, right? Very broad, but that's just our example, right? And they kept typing in Google gender discrimination in the US, and they found a few sources, but they wanted different ones. And they came up to me and said, well, there must be nothing else because I put gender discrimination in the US and I can't find anything. Well, at that point, I said, well, did you vary your key terms? And they said no. And that's the issue, right? So another word for gender discrimination is sexism, right? So do sexism in the US, and I promise you'll get different results. Or be more specific. Do sexism against, women of color in the United States, right? Gender discrimination against women of color in the United States, whatever it is that you're looking for, try to vary up those terms. This is why when we talked way early back towards the beginning of the semester, one of our pre-writing strategies was doing clustering, where you write a word and then you try to write words or phrases that are similar to that idea. This way you get a much more broader understanding of your topic and see the ways in which things connect. And so if you do that before you start researching, it can help you to come up with key terms, things that you didn't consider. One of the things that I did when I was doing my research is I was doing it on deadly plants. And so when I was looking for when British romantics were mentioning deadly plants, one of the clustering things that I did was I wrote the word deadly plants. And I wrote every type of deadly plant and every sort of different way you could say that. And I would plug those in. And honestly, that saved me because I would have been stuck if I didn't try different key terms. I would have just thought there wasn't that much out there. And just as a side note, don't know where to put this, so I'm just going to shoehorn it in right now. If you're doing any research on a female historical figure, especially if she's from I'd say, 15, 16, 1700s, sometimes 1800s, consider finding out her maiden name, because there are a lot of instances where women will, because people don't live that long, they get remarried and maybe they write something when they are married to one guy and they write something else when they're married to another guy, what have you. And it might, limit your research. So the first thing you should try to do is see how many names she went by and, type those in and see what you got. So just may not pertain to you, but it's a good thing to always keep in the back of your head for any future research you do. So now we've moved beyond the Google search. So I always like to start with Google just to see what's out there in just general society. But now you need to start doing research through those schools' library databases. And the reason why is because you'll have access to academic journals, which otherwise would be inaccessible. Depending on when this lecture is, if we've already talked about academic articles or not. Just to be aware, academic journals are often hidden by a paywall, and it does that. This way it could help hold the integrity of the journal itself, because you don't want a business buying out a journal because then they can manipulate what's being put in it, right? Because universities pay for journal subscriptions, it helps them to be unbiased. So academic articles, you're going to have to use them through your library's databases. And academic articles are some of the best quality information that we have out there. And so just to reiterate why academic articles are so valuable for research is, number one, the people who are writing them, they are credible researchers. They're usually people that have higher degrees and they're in specific fields of study. So they usually have a lot of experience in that field. Number two, whatever it is that they write, they then send it to a journal. And if you want to understand what an academic journal is, kind of imagine it like a magazine almost, right? Where a magazine is a particular, there's different types of magazines and they all publish different types of things. And within those magazines, there are different articles, right? Different things to read. Academic journals are, if you want to think about them like that, are kind of like that. So you're a researcher, you've been in your field, you write something, and again, honestly, it's probably going to take you at minimum maybe 5 years to write a really good research paper, depending if you have help or not. You then take that work that you've done and you send it to a journal, and the journal will get your work, and then they take your name off of it and they send it to anonymous reviewers. And those reviewers are also researchers or experts in that field. Those people will make comments. They'll check your research to make sure it's quality research, if your arguments make sense and stuff like that. They send it back to the journal. The journal then gives you their comments. You make changes. And this happens numerous times until it's good to go. And the reason why that's so important is because, number one, the other researchers don't know who you are, so they're not going to be biased towards you. Number two, you have other experts in those fields, likely people have been doing it for way longer than you, and they can kind of, get some insight into what it is you're saying and if it makes sense and the research you're doing is quality. And then once the journal has, said, okay, it's good to go, they didn't publish it, and it's published through a journal where a college is paying for that subscription. So you don't have to worry about, McDonald's owning a medical journal and, maybe, flipping the lid and saying, it'd be bad if somebody published, something that goes against what type of food we sell. And they sort of, brush those to the side. So that's why academic articles are some of the best forms of research. Again, not to be confused, academic articles, right, are published in journals. They're not journals themselves. Because again, if we think about an academic journal like a magazine, right, if we have Glamour Girl magazine, in Glamour Girl magazine, there are maybe 5, 6 different articles written by different authors. So academic articles, right, are published in academic journals. And there are hundreds of different types of journals that exist out there that they all specialize in things from children's lit to what are some of the other ones I've seen? There's the John Keats Percy Shelley review one, which is my personal favorite. So yeah, that's why academic articles, that's why your professors push you so much to use them, because they are the best sources of information we have out there. Again, if you want to read more about that, here's the slide. You can sit here and read that, but I've sort of given you what it is and why it's so valuable. So, how to read a scholarly article. Let's take just a few moments to understand how to read a scholarly article. Let's do that very quickly. Now, I want to first preface that not all academic articles will have these subheadings as you see here on screen. I really chose this type of academic article because you're, number one, likely going to have one, and number two, they're a little bit harder to read. Now, again, there are academic articles that use subheadings, and the subheadings are just like names of their claims or what have you. I like to make play on words with my subheadings, but these are like the more formal, like scientific research papers. So I just want to give you a little bit here about, hey, these are what these terms mean. So first off, again, even though we're doing MLA, this is an APA citation, so let's look at how to read that, because again, you're also going to know how, or you're going to have to know how to read them. So again, at the beginning, you're going to have the author's name. Again, MLA doesn't have the date right after, but the date will be located in your citation. When you see this, that is the name, right, of the article. And we know from MLA, because we just went over that the article name will always come after the author name. So that is the article name. After that, you'll have the journal name, and that should be in italics. So if you're ever confused, hey, I'm looking at this citation and I don't know which one's the article name, which one's the journal name. Number one, likely the journal name is going to have the word the journal of blah, blah, blah. Not always, or they may have the quarterly, something quarterly. Again, not always the case. There's been some journals that are like one name, but if it's in italics in your in-text or your works cited page, then that's the journal name. Then after that, that's the volume, issue number, page range. And again, this is an APA, but a lot of this is very similar to MLA. Now, almost all academic articles are going to have an abstract. I recommend before you start actually reading the paper, read the abstract, because the abstract is a summary of that paper. And that can give you a good idea as to, hey, this is useful to me, or hey, this is not useful for me, and I should just move on. After that, you may see subheadings. Again, not all academic articles, but you may see subheadings that will say either methods or materials. What you will learn under that subheading, under methods and materials, is the author is going to tell you, here's how we did the study, here's how we did the experiment. They're going to go into very, go into gritty detail about how they set up the experiment. And again, that's very important, because if you're trying to assess the quality of that article, you want to know how they did that research. But may not be very useful to you as a student. Maybe you just kind of need to get the results and discussions, right? And that's where you should look for the subheadings, results, discussions, and conclusions. And so under results, what the author is going to have under the subheading results is everything that they learned during the study. So again, if you need to know that for your paper, again, you should always read papers thoroughly, but sometimes, time constraints happen. So if you have an academic article, you've read the abstract, you're like, okay, this sounds like what I'm looking for, go ahead and jump to the results. Read, okay, this is what they learned, then go into their conclusion, because the conclusion is they're wrapping up those ideas, right? They're wrapping up what they learned, right? How, this may be applicable to future research. And then the discussion section, if they have it. In the discussion section, they're going to say, hey, right, here's the implications of this study. Here's some things that may have gone wrong. Because sometimes things do go wrong, and researcher will say, hey, right, there was maybe an issue here, so take that, into consideration when you're reading our research. Or they may say, hey, right, when we were studying this thing, something else came up that we didn't anticipate, and we don't have time to research that, but hey, if you do, definitely, right, utilize what we did and see if you can duplicate that study. So if you're in a time crunch, right, read the abstract, see if it's what you need, and then be strategic. Okay, if you need to know how they did these studies, look for their methods section, if they have it. Go to their results, go to their discussions, go to their conclusions, and that can be a very smart way to read for college. Now, if they don't have these types of subheadings, if they have, subheadings where it's like, in reference to their claim, just utilize that critical reading strategies that we talked about earlier. So before I show you how to find some of these sources, I'm going to give you a little experiment, right? So look at this, and I want you to tell me what type of source this is. I'll give you a few seconds, but, look around. What do you see? What is it saying? Give you a second. Can you tell what type of source this is? Okay, first thing to give it away, right over here, blog, right? Blog. But is this a credible blog? So the name of it then is Growing the Guest Experience at Terrace by Farlow Co. At that point, you may want to look them up because a company seems to have wrote this, right? So maybe a red flag, right? A blog, Growing the Guest Experience at Terrace Day. And then, oh, look, this blog talks about attractions, events, restaurants, places to stay. Maybe they paid to have this blog written on a website that's advertising attractions and events. Maybe not a credible source. And then we can read here. And it says, Sonia Weevil is a driving force behind Alamance County's burgeoning agro-tourism scene. The Pennsylvania native co-owns Terrace Day, a premier farm stay destination located a mere stone's throw away from the scenic Haw River in Saxamahaw. With the help of her husband and her 2 daughters, Weevil manages the working organic farm, which features 4 well-appointed guest cottages and several sheep that love to be petted by visitors. So very much trying to entice you to come here. So maybe not a credible source. Let's look at this one really quick. Sorry about my coughs. So I'll give you a few seconds and see if you can tell me what this is. What the heck is this? Now, hopefully you're playing along, right? I don't want to be sitting here just, just talking, blankly to my camera, right? I hope that you actually try to do these, right? So look around. What maybe give some of that away? What is it? You ready for me to tell you? Okay. So this is an academic article, or at least if you clicked on the download PDF part, it will be an academic article. We know that this is a journal because number one, right? Search within the journal. Gives it away that this is a journal and likely, this is going to be an academic article. This is also on Project Muse, which is an academic database. You may not have known that, but if you see Project Muse, you're like, oh, it's an academic database. Also, again, remember how I said that a lot of academic journals are either saying, they're either labeled the Journal of or something quarterly. Oh, wow, that one's got that there. Again, not always a foolproof method, but, one of the things to check off, right, on your box of, hey, what is this? Again, we have a volume and a number. Again, Sometimes newspapers will have a volume and an issue number, but we also know academic articles do, so that helps to kind of, tell us. As well as, again, I mentioned this before that, either, a lot of journals will publish in the spring and winter. Some will publish spring, summer, winter, fall. So, hey, spring 2019, right? And then you'd click on the academic article and then you could assess it from there. So, yeah, this is an academic, well, technically it's an academic journal, but, you'd click on that to be an academic article. And then, what type of source is this? This one might be a little bit easier. What are some things that, give it away? This is a news article, right? And how do you get that? We look over here, right? Here's the guy's name, science correspondent, right? Correspondent is a, newscaster or journalist. And then at BBC, right? Oh, the British Broadcasting Corporation, right? That is an incredible news source, right? As well as, right, we get top stories over here, as well as advertising, the state of journalism today, right? So, before we end this, I'm going to show you how to use Google very quickly for your research, and then how to use, at least for our purposes, how to use Fayetteville State University libraries, but definitely this can be applicable to other universities if you happen to be watching. So let's do that very quickly. All right, everyone. So let me show you a few things you can do when you're doing your research. So one of the things that will happen when you're looking up your key terms and stuff is something like this might happen, where say you're looking up North Carolina banks, right, the financial institutions, but Google is also giving you the Outer Banks, and that's not what you're looking for, right? What you can do is this thing called minus sign searching, where you put a minus sign and you put the thing you don't want. And now look what happens. Now I don't get the Outer Banks, right? So that's called minus sign searching, where you put a minus sign for the thing you don't want. And that's very helpful if you're searching something and you keep getting these results that you don't really want with your search. And it helps to then limit, the unnecessary ones and only give you the ones that may be more pertinent to your research, right? So that's minus sign searching. There's also essentially plus sign searching. It's not really that anymore, but it's essentially what plus sign searching was. So if minus sign was taking away, plus sign's kind of adding to it. So say, for instance, right, I'm looking up North Carolina wildlife, right? And I get North Carolina, right, wildlife. That's one of the first things I get. But then, right, I'm getting, let's see, right, wildlife of North Carolina. Maybe I'm looking for the actual, North Carolina Wildlife Commission, right? North Carolina Wildlife. This one just says, NCs, right? It's bolding the things that it's, pulling out, because one of the things you have to remember when you're using Google, it's not smart. It can only do what it is that you tell it to do. And so it doesn't look for the words in that order. It looks just for how many times each of these words are occurring. So I'm not always going to get what it is that I'm looking for. So one of the things I might want to do is, if I want it specifically the Wildlife Commission, I'd put in quotation marks commission. And now, because it's in quotation marks, Google isn't going to look for how many times the word wildlife and the word commission appear on a web page. Now it's going to look specifically for Wildlife Commission together in that order. And now, look, I'm starting to get different results. Right now, I'm not getting the Wikipedia articles, right? I'm getting North Carolina Wildlife Commission. Right, there we go. Some other things to keep in mind. We talked about Wikipedia. Shakespeare. So, say I'm looking up the Titania from Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, right? And this is why I said Wikipedia can sometimes be good. I just want to throw this in here, right? I can read this stuff, and then I can, click on, hey, this is going to link me to another source, or it'll have a to. And if I hit that to, it'll take me to that source. Now, again, this one appears to be a book. So then I'd have to look for that book through our library resources. But, right, something like this, you know, if I went to find the number 12 and see what it was talking about, here I can now sort of guess, you know, or not guess, but look at this article or this website and see if it's, you know, a quality. And this is a Tumblr. So, ooh, you know, depending on what the information is, may not be credible. So yeah, keep that in mind. So again, whatever you're reading, right, see if it's got a, you know, a little number there up at the top, and then go down there and see, you know, if it lines up or if the resource is quality. This one, I picked this one just because I've added to it. This was something that I added, and yeah, I cited it. There we go. So let's go to our library. Again, we're at Fayetteville State, so we'll use Fayetteville State. And let's use the journal finder. So they kind of have what Google has, which was that plus and minus sign searching. And Google has the same thing. Let me show you that real quick. Google Advanced Search, right? So similar to sort of the library, Google also has this as well, where, you know, I can put in, right, North Carolina Wildlife Management. I can put specifically wildlife management. Remember when I did that in quotation marks? That's what that is going to do. I can omit things. So if I do, you know, Federation, right? I can scroll to the bottom, hit advanced search, and it does all that work for me, right? That's what an advanced search is. It's getting more specific now. Your school can also do that as well. One of the things I recommend is just sort of, you know, looking for specific journals. So again, as I said, all journals will publish things, you know, specific to what it is that they're studying. And so here I would maybe go ahead and go to a particular journal. So if you're doing something in African American studies, start here, and then try to look for articles. I personally, let's see, which one should we use today? Let's do English, because that's our thing, right? So we'll click on English. This is the journal finder. And these are all the sort of journals that you can use. But say, you know, this is much too advanced for you. Maybe you're just like, ooh, you know, I don't know I don't even know what type of journals are out there, right? Maybe I just want to find, you know, academic articles. Maybe I just want to find, you know, look for sources kind of like how I do in Google, and I don't really want to worry about trying to, you know what a journal is and stuff like that. So if that's the case, go here to just the basic Fayetteville State University, look for Chestnut Library. Here you can type in, you know, I was helping a student do the welfare queen stereotype, so we can do a search here. And I don't have to know a particular journal. This one will pull up articles based on what it is that I'm looking for, right? So here, right, it's going to start giving me articles. Now, the one thing about that you should know when using the library resources is it'll go ahead and tell you what type of source it is. So this is a news article. It's not an academic article. Hey, this one is an academic journal, right? And it talks about these things. This one's an academic journal, right? So that helps you. But if you don't want to like sit here and manually filter them, look over here on the side and you can click ebooks, right? Which may be helpful, right? Let's do some ebooks. Let it update. Got to think about it. And let's also do academic journals, because maybe we want to, you know, have a wide variety of different types of sources. And then here, right, I can go through them, you know, read through them. Now, let's do one more. So let's do Cowboy Bebop, my favorite anime of all time, right? And let's search. And again, it's going to give me ebooks. Over here, I could always click peer review because we know academic articles are peer reviewed. So if you wanted to be doubly sure, right, we could do that. And we have to put our source types back in because, again, look, that's a news article, a periodical, so we don't want that. So let's do academic journals. And if I wanted to, I could always hit peer review just to make sure. So let's do this one. This one seems interesting, right? I got to sign in, so give me a sec. All right, so I signed in, right? Don't want to show you my password, but I signed in. And here, right, this may happen to you. I would have to request this document. Fayetteville State doesn't have access to it. So, but it's as easy as me clicking here and it'll take me to the source I need for the librarian to then email me a copy. So let's do a different one. Let's hit search again, since we're already in the databases. Let's do a different one. Let's go back over here. The only thing that's really annoying, you have to always kind of click academic journals. Small price to pay, right? So let's just do, I'm trying to find something. Let's do this one. See if we got access to it. Oh, we don't have access to it. That's great. Okay, so let's just do, maybe instead of something secure, something maybe obscure, let's do something that's likely we'll be able to find. So here's an academic journal. Here it's telling me it does have the PDF, right? It's right there. However, if you wanted to, you know, make sure, we can click here. Here it'll tell you the abstract, so you can kind of read it before you have to download that PDF. And then when I do download the PDF, right, I know it's an academic article just by reading this, because again, here are the authors. I can check their credibility. Here's the name of the article. And then depending on what article is, you know, you may have to, like over here on the side, it tells us our volume or issue number. Some academic articles will have it written up here at the top. Some will have it on the bottom here again, you know, it's also got the page numbers. It's one of those things, academic articles aren't always uniform in the way that they look, but that's sort of the gist. They'll always have the name of the article here, the researchers, and then either the rest of that information like volume, issue number, page numbers, they'll be either at the top. This one has on the side, which I've never seen, which is interesting, and then at the bottom, as well as your database will give you some of that information over here on the side. So this one comes from the American Journal of Public Health. One other thing to consider while we're here is that Google also has a database similar to the libraries. It's called Google Scholar. And what's really cool is, for instance, I think it's signed into mine. Yeah, it's signed into mine. Okay, cool. So one of the things that's cool is, say for instance, right? Let's do Cowboy Bebop again, right? And I'm like, oh, this one looks really cool, right? What I can do is not only, you know, open it up, kind of like what we did with the library resources, and go, oh, this looks really cool, and, you know, read it and stuff like that. I can save it. I would hit the cite button. The cite button is almost never works. I'd hit save, and then if you see over here, right, I've made some folders. And what's cool is I can now go to my library, and I can click through all my folders, and I've saved my articles here, so I don't have to download them on my computer. So that's really nice if you know, make a folder for a particular class and you put those sources in there so you don't lose them later, because a lot of students will lose them, and then if you like played around with a bunch of keywords, it may be hard to then find it again. Or if you did a bunch of minus sign searching, it may be hard to find it again. The only issue you might have with Google Scholar is that sometimes if you're not on the school Wi-Fi or using a school computer, because academic articles are in academic journals and they are subscription-based, you may not have access to it. Like, I don't have access to it right now. However, what I could do is copy the name, so Control-C, go to my database, right? Put in the name, give it a second to think about it, and then wow, here it is. Now again, Fayetteville State doesn't have this one, so all I would do is request this document, so I'd hit this button, type it in, and they would send it to me. Or you could physically go to the library and say, hey, I don't have access to this, you know, talk to the librarian, can you get me access to it? And they'll usually take your information and send it to you. Usually, they do it pretty fast, so don't be discouraged if you read something, you're like, dang it, I can't read it now. Oh, there's the book, actually. Your librarian can get it to you, or you can always ask me and I'll get you a copy. Shush. So, hopefully this was helpful. This is how to do that basic key searches. And again, you know, make sure to change up your keywords, right? Utilize advanced search, kind of like what we talked about. This does some of the things that, you know, Google searching does, where you can, you know, put in different key terms here. You can, you know, tell, you know, hey, you know, I want it peer reviewed. I want it, you know, maybe if you wanted an image quality, you could put that down there. So there's a lot of similarities between Google and library. The library might be just more cumbersome, so I would utilize both of them at the same time. It'll help you to get many more sources than you can naturally. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you have any questions or you want to ask me anything, as always, please ask me, and I'll see you guys next time.